It was really tempting to start this off with something like, you know what gets overlooked in fighting games? The music. But that's not true at all. Music is quite often in the spotlight, both for good and bad reasons. It's more so that the scope of the discussion is usually limited to just how enjoyable or exciting that music is. It makes sense, of course. In a fighting game you do want something that would get you pumped for battle. But there is so much more to music that rarely gets brought up. Music and sound in general have a massive impact on what we feel and how we perceive things. Just think of any iconic scene from almost any piece of media, and there is probably a powerful piece of music associated with it. It's as much of a storytelling tool as dialogue, editing, or shot composition. And with games being an interactive medium, music also gains a whole other dimension of being a gameplay tool. In this video, we want to talk about this less explored aspect of fighting game music, and point out how what you hear can become a defining element of the game, supplementing the characterization, pacing, gameplay, and even world building. So, something to note right off the bat is that while music can potentially interact with the rest of the work in incredibly complex and nuanced ways, that's not always the case. Far from it, actually. Making sure that the music is deeply embedded in all other elements of the game is a fairly tall task. So, throughout the history of video games, most composers would settle on achieving the base goal of creating something that sounds good and fits with what is happening on the screen. After all, any game is more enjoyable with some nice music in the background, and during the arcade era, it was one of the major ways to attract people to your cabinet. However, even at the simplest, most general level, music inevitably communicates something about the game. It often tells us what kind of atmosphere the game wants to create, what sort of tone or mood is it going for, what kind of aesthetic does it want to tap into. One of my favorite examples in this regard is Mortal Kombat, especially the original trilogy. This is not usually a series that people note for having great music, but a big part of that is the soundtrack being inseparable from the games. What I mean by that is that if you listen to something like the Tekken soundtrack outside of the game, it's still dope electronic music. It's pretty versatile. Meanwhile, the sounds of Mortal Kombat are very specifically made to match what you're seeing in the game, and I think it does an undeniably great job in this regard. It's so cold and uncomfortable. Every track screams to you that this is a hostile and gritty world where hyperviolence and battles to the death are a normal occurrence. Just as this music is inseparable from the game is inseparable from the music. While people usually remember the iconic techno syndrome from the Immortals when they think of MK, it's the Dan Forden soundtrack that truly shaped the identity of what Mortal Kombat is. Which is why it's probably the best example of how music can define the tone and atmosphere of the game. That said, this still applies to some extent to basically every fighting game out there. For example, the implications of music in something like Asuka 120% might not be as obvious, but they're still there. It also seeks to create a specific mood by working off of the visuals. In this case, that's the early 90s shoujo anime aesthetic. So it only makes sense that the soundtrack would also try to match the music of those shows, which were themselves inspired by the many different J-pop artists of that era. Street Fighter II also serves as a fascinating example here, because this classic OST composed by Yoko Shimomura did quite a few things at once. For starters, SF2 overall had this emphasis on variety. You literally travel around the world to see interesting places and landmarks, but also all sorts of different people and martial arts. A uniform soundtrack would go against this direction and undermine the game. So instead they tried to incorporate different characteristics of the area and/or the character into the music. And they did so by mixing different genres, composition styles, and especially instrumentation. In a way, SF2 would become the golden standard for a lot of fighting games going forward, not just in terms of gameplay, but also approach to soundtrack. However, when it comes to developing characters through music, it's gonna be hard to find an example better than Guilty Gear, and especially Strive. Older games in the series already had this heavy emphasis on matching the tone of the music to the character. Kai's theme in the very first game already highlighted him as being a chivalrous knight in the service of his kingdom. It's meticulous, strained, and very dramatic in a way that tells you how serious he is about his duty. Meanwhile, both Soul and his theme are the complete opposite. Melodically, it's a lot more simple, but it has a steady, confident groove to it, with an occasional fiery guitar solo. That said, Strive arguably went much further in defining its roster through their music. Unlike in the previous games, or unlike in fighting games in general, all character themes are vocal. And not only that, but pretty much all of them are written from the perspective of these characters. And yeah, some of the lyrics kind of border on gibberish, but they still tell you a story about who they are, what happened to them in the past, how they feel, or what their goals are. There is basically no limit to what the vocals can express. However, to feed into this purpose, Arxis did another polarizing change by moving away from metal and rock. Those genres still dominate the score, but now you also have some pop music, like with Bridget or May themes, or even more operatic influences with Zato's theme. That last one even goes through multiple genres to convey Zato effectively being two characters in one, with both having a somewhat complex relationship with each other. Now, we've talked about how music connects to the tone of the game, the setting, and even characters, from their overall vibe to actual writing. But what about the gameplay? Believe it or not, but talking about the gameplay implementation of fighting game music will once again take us back to 1991. Street Fighter II was again sort of ahead of its time and added a little feature where the music would speed up dramatically when one of the players was on low health. Did it have a direct impact on the gameplay? Well, no, but music has the power to influence how we feel, which in turn has an impact on how we play. In terms of music theory, a crescendo and an increase in tempo typically communicate similar things. With greater speed and volume comes the growing intensity. It tells us that something important is happening, the stakes are rising, and you should pay attention. It's such a simple but effective way to tell both players that the momentum of the match itself has shifted, and they should focus up to either secure the victory or make the comeback. Since then, the series would continue to play with this idea in subsequent titles, adding more situational changes, like different mixes depending on the round in SF3, or adding more conditions when the music changed in SF4, where the music also reacted to end of the round and filling your revenge meter. And of course, Street Fighter VI is the current peak of this approach, building on top of the previous foundation and making music even more reactive. They even added a lot of small touches, like the Kimberly Level 3 song, which has a different version just for the occasion when two Kims use the level 3 super in the same round. Funnily enough though, despite putting so much effort into dynamic music, Street Fighter VI OST has to be one of the most controversial ones in the series. And part of it certainly lies in the fact that the music itself seems to have traded some of its personality in favor of being subtle and shifting into different layers without attracting attention. A far cry from the past games that were usually all about bombastic tracks that stood out as more than just background music. And going back to Kimberly's special music, Arxis did something similar quite a long time ago, and we would be remiss not to mention it. While their music is typically not concerned with responding to or tying into the gameplay state, there is one massive exception here, and that is install supers. Soul always had one of those, and while it's technically a powered up state, it's a pretty bad option for you to use, at least if you play with the music off, because in Xrd, the existence of Ride the Fire by itself completely redeems the move. The developers really wanted to highlight the gameplay change as something truly special, so here you go, an entirely new vocal track with an incredibly hype intro, and you only ever get to hear this if you use this move. If you want to make a certain element of the game to feel special and memorable, that's certainly a great way to do it. Blaze Blue isn't slacking here either. Bang is quite a charismatic character in his own right, but much like Soul, what really cements him as an absolute legend is that the moment his install drops, the spotlight is on Bang and only Bang. It helps that his install is far superior in strength, but even if it wasn't, it's hard to resist the sheer charm of an anime opening type song that starts blasting through the speakers. One of the versions is even performed by the Bang's voice actor, which gives it some additional points in my book. While we're at it, even if it's not an install, it's also important to highlight Schoolgirls. a game where you can literally play your own music thanks to the existence of Big Band and his extremely creative super move. However, the crown for the best fusion of music, gameplay and visuals has to go to the one and only Killer Instinct. That's right, Ki wins again. The original games were not slouching when it came to the soundtrack. Rare composers have been consistently putting out some of the best video game music out there, but it's the reboot that showed the full extent of what fighting game music is capable of, which is yet another way in which it was far ahead of its time. Hold Back to Block did 2 excellent documentaries on the audio and character themes of Killer Instinct. And even if you think you don't care about something like that, I suggest you at least give it a try. Because listening to Mick Gordon describe his process for creating the soundtrack and working on the sound design is incredibly mesmerizing. We cannot possibly do it justice here, but there are still some crucial points to highlight. For starters, Mick very much doubled down on conveying the spirit of the game and the characters through the music. While it doesn't hop from genre to genre quite like some of the other games we mentioned, you would be hard-pressed to find a single track that doesn't sound distinct. Just to put it into perspective, when making the theme of Spinal, an undead skeleton pirate, Mick Gordon got a hold of Kangling. That's a Tibetan instrument made out of a human femur bone, and is typically used for ritualistic purposes. Did he have to do this? Absolutely not. But this is the sort of thing that gives music an additional flavor, and the sound of this thing is unbelievable.
As you can hear, it has a very particular quality about it.
And this is not just him playing favorites with Spinal. Behind every track there is a story of trying to create music that would match the identity of the character and their stage, to make sure that the music, gameplay and visuals are synonymous with each other. Of course, this also meant making the music reactive and interactive. They wanted to put players in charge of the songs, so a lot of the key elements will have a noticeable impact on the music. For example, filling up the instinct meter will slowly bring in a new layer into the mix, and it will pan around the speakers depending on where the character with the meter is standing. They even considered the question, what if nobody does anything? So if you literally just stand around and do nothing, the game will fade in the remixes of classic songs. That said, the best part has to be how they handled the combos. Pulling off an impressive combo always feels good, especially in KI, where it means that you probably really out-mind-gamed your opponent during the actual combo. To sort of celebrate that and to pump up the player, KI music will kick in the chorus of the current track, and it can keep going if both players keep doing big combos. With combo breakers being an important element of KI, that has to be taken into consideration as well. So even doing a combo breaker has its own musical flair that feels really cool even if you were on the receiving end of it.
And if there's a combo breaker, we'd have these combo breaker sections that would immediately stop the music from continuing the chorus. And so it would kind of interrupt the chorus, but still in a musical way, which was kind of cool.
And of course, then there are the musical ultra combos. It's almost hard to believe, but what has become the game's calling card was simply a random idea in the heat of the moment, inspired by the common trailer technique of syncing sound effects to the music. Even though the game was already pretty over the top, they wanted to do something even bigger and more climactic. So they chose to amp up the iconic finishers. The amount of work that went into creating something so satisfying is so much more difficult than you might expect. The animations had to be built around the rhythm, and not only that, the sounds used for attacks had to be inherently musical as well. And of course, to make sure that it all feels coherent, Mick Gordon had to come up with a crazy system of creating a set of 50 notes for each stage, just to ensure that the ultra combos always sound organic and match the stage.
It's really messy. It does work and get it done. Would I do it like that again? Hell no.
Funnily enough, both he and the game's sound director feel like they could have done a much better job these days. But even back then in 2013, they created a fighting game that blends music and gameplay in a way that we haven't really seen before or since. Instead of writing background music and creating subtle transitions, music became one of the driving forces that influenced the pace of the matches, player behavior, and gameplay feedback. Over a decade has passed, and this is still the golden standard that other fighting games haven't truly matched. As you can see, the impact that music can have on the game cannot be overstated. It can get us into the rhythm of the gameplay, it can tell us about the world of the game, or the characters living in it. It can teach us about the current state of the fight, or simply give us some tunes to really get into the mood for clobbering people. It's not necessary to do all of this at once to make a great soundtrack, but it's worth paying attention to music and looking into how it ties into the game and what it manages to achieve, both for the sake of criticism and appreciation for the game. We went over some examples of this in today's video, but there's a lot more that we could have talked about if we had more time. Like how Sega managed to create their own musical identity across different genres, or how Tekken's unique approach to final round music managed to not only raise the stakes, but also create memorable community moments, or how Soul Calibur chose classical music to fit with the fictional medieval period of the game. But for now, we'll have to ask how you feel about this. Which game do you think used music in a memorable way? What sort of approach is your favorite? And does it even matter if the music fits into the gameplay or not? Can't wait to read what you folks have to say, and as always, thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed the video, please consider dropping a like or a sub, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.